On a Friday in January of 1877, a young woman in diamond earrings and diamond rings stepped off a train in Jefferson, Texas, with a man who signed the hotel register as A. Monroe. She had 2 days left to live. Jefferson was a river port, one of the busiest west of the Mississippi, and strangers came through often enough. But this woman stopped people in the street. She wore clusters of diamonds at her ears, heavy rings on both hands, a brooch at her collar that caught the winter light. In a town where the wealthiest citizens wore cotton and broadcloth, the jewelry on this woman was hard to look away from. The locals started calling her Diamond Bessie before they learned her real name. She was 22 years old, maybe 23. She and Monroe took room number 4 at the Brooks house, a wooden boarding house on the bayou. The man beside her was not A. Monroe. His name was Abraham Rothschild, the eldest son of Meyer Rothschild, a jeweler on West 5th Street in Cincinnati. He was 23, a traveling salesman for his father's business, and he had registered under a false name in a town where nobody knew either of them. He and Bessie had been married 11 days earlier in room 52 of the Etna Hotel in Danville, Illinois. A justice of the peace named McMahon performed the ceremony. A local newspaper reporter came by that evening and took notes. The question of why a jeweler's son would travel under a false name with a wife he was hiding from his family would not trouble anyone in Jefferson for another 15 days. Diamond Bessie was not her real name, and the one she used was probably not real either. The newspapers that covered her death called her Annie Stone, a shoe dealer's daughter from Syracuse, New York. Later research pointed to Annie Moore instead, and to evidence that Annie Stone was a different woman entirely, one who had died years earlier in the same region. A March 1877 issue of the Watertown Times identified the victim as Annie Moore on the testimony of people who had known her personally. The confusion was never resolved. What the record agreed on was this: she left home around the age of 15 after her father died and took up with a man named Moore. She kept his last name. By her late teens, she was living in houses of mixed reputation in Cincinnati, then New Orleans, then Hot Springs, then Chicago. At Jenny Williams' establishment on 88 4th Avenue in Chicago, she was known simply as Bessie Moore. She wintered in the South, as many women in her position did, following the warm weather from Hot Springs to the Gulf and back again. She had numerous admirers. The diamonds she wore were their gifts. They were the only wealth she carried, and she carried all of it on her body. She met Rothschild in the mid-1870s. The circumstances were unclear. Some accounts placed their first meeting in Hot Springs, others in Cincinnati. He was a jeweler's son who drank too much and had a taste for the sporting life. His family, German immigrants from Baden who had built a successful business on West 5th Street, disapproved of the attachment and eventually disowned him. He used aliases long before he went to Texas. A reporter from the Danville News met her on the night of her wedding to Rothschild. He described a woman with auburn hair arranged in a French twist, large blue eyes, and a complexion and figure that would have tired the heart of an Italian sculptor. Other accounts would later give her black hair and gray eyes. No photograph of Bessie was ever taken. She existed only in other people's descriptions, and the descriptions did not agree. According to one account, Rothschild had been arrested in Cincinnati for striking her on a public street. He married her anyway. She went to Texas with him anyway. The diamonds are gone. The name is not. We go looking for people like Bessie, the ones the record almost lost. Subscribe and come back for the next one. On the morning of Sunday, the 21st of January, Rothschild walked to Henrique's restaurant and bought 2 lunches. He came back to the Brooks house, collected Bessie, and the 2 of them crossed the Iron Bridge over Big Cypress Bayou, heading south along the Marshall Road. A man named Frank Malloy, who lived near the crossing, watched them pass sometime before 11 o'clock. He noticed the diamonds, that was the last time anyone saw Bessie Moore alive. The January air was cold. A heavy snow had fallen in the days before, unusual for East Texas, and the ground along the road was soft and wet. The woods on either side were thick stands of oak and pine, dense enough to swallow anyone who stepped 20 paces off the path. The Marshall Road ran south from Jefferson, through low woods and farmland. The bridge over the bayou was the only direct crossing. On the far side, the road narrowed and the trees closed in. A person could walk half a mile from the bridge and be entirely out of sight. By 2 in the afternoon, Rothschild was seen walking back toward town. He was alone. Whether he returned over the same bridge or came by another road, the sources could not agree. That evening, at supper, he told the other guests at the Brooks house that his wife was staying with friends on the far side of the bayou. No one questioned it. The following morning, Monday the 22nd, Rothschild came down for breakfast alone. Jenny Simpson, the chambermaid at the Brooks house, had been up since before dawn, hauling water and stripping beds. She was in and out of the rooms that morning, doing her work, when she noticed something on the guests' hands, large diamond rings. She recognized them. She had seen those rings before, on the fingers of the woman who had arrived with him on Friday. Simpson was a black woman working in a boarding house in East Texas. She was not in a position to put questions to a white guest from Cincinnati. She noticed what she noticed and said nothing. On Tuesday the 23rd, Rothschild checked out. He carried 2 sets of luggage, his own and Bessie's trunk, which he sent ahead by rail. The trunk bore the name A. Moore. The handwriting on the shipping tag would later be compared to his registration at the Capitol Hotel in Marshall, where he had signed his real name 4 days earlier. He boarded the eastbound train and left Jefferson. The friends across the bayou, the ones Bessie was supposedly visiting, were never located. No one matching that description was ever found. It would be nearly 3 years before Simpson told a courtroom what she had seen that Monday morning. When she did, a United States senator would spend hours trying to persuade a jury she was wrong. On the 5th of February, 15 days after Bessie and Rothschild had crossed the bridge, a woman named Sarah King was gathering firewood in the woods along the Marshall Road south of town. King was black, and she was doing what working people did in a cold East Texas winter, collecting what the trees dropped. She found the body in a clearing near an oak. Bessie was fully dressed. A single gunshot wound marked her left temple. Beside her lay the remains of a picnic. Chicken bones, breadcrumbs in wrapping paper, a bottle of beer half finished. The January snow had covered her and then melted away. Decomposition had begun around the wound, but her face was still recognizable after 2 weeks in the open air. Her hands were bare. Every ring was gone. One finger appeared to have been broken in the effort to remove a ring that would not slide free. The coroner held an inquest and ruled the cause of death a gunshot wound to the head. An examination of the body confirmed that she had not been pregnant, contrary to a rumor that circulated widely then and persisted for years afterward. The remains of the picnic beside her suggested she had been sitting on the ground, eating, when she was shot. The connection was immediate. The woman from the Brooks house, the one with the diamonds, the man who left town alone with her jewelry and her trunk. The entry in the hotel register at Marshall, signed in his real name, A. Rothschild and wife, Cincinnati, Ohio. Bessie Moore had been in Jefferson for 2 days. She had spoken to almost no one. She had no family in Texas, no friends who came forward, no one to claim the body. The town claimed her. Citizens of Jefferson collected $150 for a proper burial. They laid her in Oakwood Cemetery under the name Diamond Bessie, because it was the only name they had. No headstone was placed. No family existed to choose one. Then they went after her killer. Sheriff John Vines organized a trip to Cincinnati to arrest Abraham Rothschild. The town paid for the journey. Vines traveled with Dr. Turner and a citizen named Edward Guthridge, and the expenses came from the same community that had just paid for the funeral. A warrant had initially been issued for A. Monroe. Once the hotel records in Marshall connected Monroe to Rothschild, a second warrant followed under his real name. The governor of Texas, Richard B. Hubbard, called the murder a crime unparalleled in the record of blood. The Rothschild family in Cincinnati did not cooperate quietly. When Vines arrived with the warrant, the family mounted habeas corpus proceedings to block the extradition. The hearing drew attention. The extradition was approved on the 19th of March, but the resistance confirmed what Jefferson already suspected. The family had resources, and it intended to use them. The prosecution that followed was funded the same way the funeral had been, by citizens of Jefferson putting their own money in. The attorneys who took the case for the state worked as volunteers, compensated by community contributions. This was not a government pursuing justice through its ordinary machinery. This was a town that had decided collectively that the death of a woman it barely knew would not pass unanswered. The people who buried Bessie could not have agreed on the color of her eyes. One newspaper had written blue, another gray. A third said steel-colored. It did not matter. A woman had arrived with diamonds on her hands. A man had left with those diamonds on his. Everything else was detail. The distance between what Jefferson could afford and what the Rothschild family could buy would shape everything that followed. Abraham Rothschild returned to Cincinnati in late January and began drinking heavily. According to press accounts, he grew restless and suspicious, convinced he was being followed. In late February, inside Jake Ogg's clubhouse, a gambling hall near the center of the city, he shot himself. The bullet took his right eye. He survived. His first story was that he had been attacked. He later changed it to an accidental discharge. Neither version explained why a man who had just left Texas with his wife's jewelry would put a pistol to his own face in a gambling hall. The diamonds, meanwhile, traced their own path. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported in September of that year that Rothschild had pawned Bessie's jewelry in the months following her death. The rings that Jenny Simpson had seen on his fingers in January were now behind a pawnbroker's counter. They had traveled from Bessie's hands to his, from his to a shop drawer. They would never be presented as evidence in any courtroom. Rothschild was brought back to Texas after the extradition was approved. He arrived in Marshall, wearing a black patch over his right eye. The town that had paid to bring him there got its first look at the man it had been chasing for 2 months. In December of 1878, nearly 2 years after the murder, Abraham Rothschild stood trial in Harrison County, in Marshall. The venue had been moved from Marion County at the defense's request. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced him to death by hanging. For a moment, Jefferson had won. The machinery assembled against that verdict was unlike anything the volunteer prosecutors could have matched. The Rothschild family retained 10 defense attorneys. Among them were David B. Culberson, a sitting United States Senator, and his son Charles A. Culberson, who would later become governor of Texas. One of the lawyers reportedly said that after the fee he received, he would never need to work again. Rothschild's time in the Marshall jail bore no resemblance to ordinary imprisonment. Andrew Columbus, a local man hired to bring the prisoners' meals from the hotel, described the arrangement in terms the newspapers preserved. His cell was fixed up like a hotel room, with a fine Brussels rug, nice tables and chairs, and plenty of beer and whiskey. The food came from a hotel kitchen, not the jail's. Among his fellow inmates was a man named Jim Curry, a railroad detective who had shot an actor named Maurice Barrymore during a dispute aboard a train. Barrymore survived and became the patriarch of an acting dynasty. The Marshall jail that year held more than its share of American theater. The trial itself drew the kind of attention the state had not seen before. Press from across Texas and as far as Cincinnati covered the proceedings. The prosecution built its case on the circumstantial chain, the hotel registers connecting Monroe to Rothschild, the pawned diamonds, Simpson's testimony about the rings, the body with the jewelry stripped away, the false name, the second set of luggage. No witness had seen the killing itself. No weapon was recovered. The prosecution argued that the chain, taken whole, left no other reasonable explanation. Against this, 10 lawyers funded by family wealth and a community's entire investment in justice, amounting to a fraction of what the defense spent on a single fee. The appeal went to the 7th Texas Court of Appeals. Judge J. Clark reviewed the trial proceedings and found 2 procedural defects. The county attorney had been present in the room while the grand jury deliberated the indictment. One of the seated jurors had stated, before the trial began, that he already held an opinion about the defendant's guilt. On these grounds, Clark overturned the conviction and ordered a new trial. The evidence had not been challenged. The facts had not changed. Simpson's testimony about the rings, the pawned diamonds, the false name, the 2 sets of luggage, the body beside a half-eaten picnic in the January woods. Nothing had been disputed on appeal. The guilty verdict fell because of how the courtroom had been administered, not because of what happened inside it. For Jefferson, the reversal meant starting over. 3 years of effort, $150 for a funeral, the sheriff's trip to Cincinnati, the volunteer prosecutors, 3 weeks of trial, a death sentence, undone by a flaw in the procedural record. A new indictment was filed on the 2nd of December, 1880. The second trial would take place in Jefferson itself, in the county where the murder had occurred. The ruling was the kind of defeat that sticks. Jefferson had done everything right. The town had found the body, identified the suspect, funded the arrest, paid for the prosecution, sat through 3 weeks of trial, and secured a conviction and a death sentence. The appeals court did not say the evidence was insufficient. It said the paperwork was flawed. The distinction was lost on no one. The community that had been paying for justice since 1877 would have to pay again. The Rothschild family had never stopped paying. The same legal team reassembled. The same evidence would be presented to a different jury, in a different courtroom, against the same resources. The second trial opened in Jefferson in mid-December of 1880. The courtroom was full. The case had drawn attention across the state, and spectators packed the gallery and the corridor beyond it. The prosecution called its witnesses and presented the same evidence. Jenny Simpson returned to the stand. She said what she had said in Marshall 2 years earlier. On the morning of Monday, the 22nd of January, 1877, she had seen large diamond rings on the hands of Abraham Rothschild. She recognized them. They were the rings she had seen on the hands of the woman who arrived with him 3 days before. The rings were distinctive, clusters of stones set in heavy gold, the kind of jewelry a chambermaid who handled guests' belongings every day was unlikely to confuse. Senator David B. Culberson rose for cross-examination. What followed took hours. He did not argue that Simpson was lying. He argued that she was mistaken. He questioned her memory, her eyesight, her familiarity with fine jewelry. He pressed on specifics. Which hand, which finger, what setting, what size? He asked whether a chambermaid in a boarding house could reliably distinguish one set of diamond rings from another. He asked whether she was certain about the day. Monday, not Tuesday, not Sunday. The defense also called Isabel Gouldy, one of the women who had prepared Bessie's body for burial. Gouldy testified that she had seen the woman known as Diamond Bessie alive in Jefferson on the 20th and again on the 25th of January in the company of a different man. If true, Bessie was alive both before and after the date. The prosecution said she had been murdered, and alive in the company of someone who was not Rothschild. The prosecution challenged the account. Gouldy's dates did not align with any other testimony. No other witness placed Bessie alive after the 21st. A second defense argument questioned the body itself. A corpse exposed to the elements for 15 days, the lawyers contended, could not have been as well preserved as the one Sarah King found. The features were too clear. The clothing was too intact. Something did not match the timeline. Two versions of events occupied the same courtroom. In one, a chambermaid saw diamond rings pass from a dead woman's hands to her killer's, and the body found 2 weeks later confirmed what she already knew. In the other, the woman was alive. After the alleged murder, the rings were someone else's, and the condition of the body did not fit. Both could not be true. Simpson had seen the truth. She had carried it for nearly 3 years and spoken it twice, in 2 courtrooms, plainly and without wavering. Whether it would hold was no longer something she could control. She was a black chambermaid in a Texas court. Culberson was a United States senator retained at a fee that could have paid her wages for years. The substance of her testimony had not changed since Marshall. The weight pressed against it had. On the 30th of December, 1880, at 4 in the afternoon, the jury retired to deliberate. Among the 12 men were 2 black jurors, a composition reflecting the Supreme Court's decision earlier that year in Strouder v. West Virginia, which had struck down the racial exclusion of jurors. At 8 o'clock that evening, the jury returned. Not guilty. 3 years of effort. $150 for a stranger's funeral. A sheriff's journey across state lines. Volunteer prosecutors working on donated time. A guilty verdict already won and overturned on a procedural flaw. A second trial, the same evidence, the same witnesses, 4 hours. Abraham Rothschild left the courtroom with his mother and father. They took a carriage to the depot and boarded the night train for Cincinnati. A newspaper of the period stated it plainly. Certainly, all that is required to save a man from the gallows are 2 or 3 active friends and sufficient money. The December night was cold. The people who had paid for the prosecution walked home through it. Abraham Rothschild returned to Cincinnati and disappeared from respectable life. Over the decades that followed, his name surfaced in police records across the continent. In 1909, the New York Times reported his conviction in Pennsylvania for a diamond swindle valued at $250,000. He used dozens of aliases: Joseph Yeager, Henry Smythe, Joseph Baum, Coleman, Jackman, and others the record has lost. By his own account, he faced more than 200 criminal charges over the course of his life. He married again, a woman named Mabel, who was 27 years his junior. They had 2 children, a daughter named Rosa and a son named Meyer, after the father who had paid for his defense and whose name he kept dragging through court records. He moved through the United States, Canada, Mexico, Cuba, England, and France, always a step ahead of the next warrant, always under a different name. The date and place of his death are unknown. One report placed him in Baltimore in 1923. Possibly drowned, possibly not. No verified grave has been located. In Jefferson, Bessie's grave at Oakwood Cemetery sat unmarked for decades. The wooden marker placed at her burial had rotted long ago. No family came to claim her. Sometime in the 1930s, a headstone appeared. No one knew who had placed it. The stone was modest, engraved with a name and a date. The date was wrong. It read December 31st, not January 21st. The name was right. Diamond Bessie. In 1941, a retired foundry worker named E.B. McDonald told a reporter he had done it. He had placed it there one night, he said, because it did not seem right for Diamond Bessie to sleep in an unmarked grave. In 1936, the Jesse Allen Wise Garden Club of Jefferson began staging an annual production of the Diamond Bessie murder trial. The play has run every year since, one of the longest-running community theatrical events in Texas. The grave now sits inside an iron fence. People leave flowers. A piece of local folklore holds that a handsome elderly man with a patch over his right eye was seen at the grave more than once in the 1890s. No record confirms it. It may be nothing more than a story the town told itself, because the thought that he never came back at all was harder to bear than the thought that he did. Rothschild won the verdict and lost everything after it. The woman he killed in the woods beside the Marshall Road kept the name the town gave her, and the town kept her. The diamonds were pawned, scattered, and never entered as evidence. They vanished the way he did. The name outlasted them all.